Chapter 1. The Painting Nobody Wanted. The rain had barely stopped by the time the last mourners drifted away from the old stone church. Gray clouds lingered overhead, wrapping the countryside in a quiet sadness that seemed fitting for the woman everyone had come to bury. Eleanor Ashcroft had lived a long life, yet as her funeral ended, the silence left behind felt heavier than the service itself. To most of the family, she had simply been the elderly matriarch whose estate was waiting to be divided. To Amelia, however, she had been something far more precious, the only person who had ever made her feel like she truly belonged. As the family gathered inside Eleanor's centuries-old manor, grief gave way to impatience. The family lawyer opened the will while whispered conversations quickly turned into arguments over valuables. Diamond necklaces disappeared into velvet boxes. Antique silverware was carefully wrapped. Oil paintings, rare furniture, farmland, investment accounts, and bank certificates were claimed one after another, each item sparking another debate about who deserved the larger share. Amelia stood quietly near the back of the room, ignored as always. She had long since grown accustomed to being treated as an outsider, the forgotten granddaughter whose opinions carried little weight. No one asked what she wanted. No one expected her to inherit anything of importance. When nearly everything had been distributed, only a large portrait remained leaning against the library wall. Its once golden frame had darkened with age, and decades of dust dulled the painted surface. The canvas depicted an elegantly dressed woman whose identity no one seemed to remember. One of Amelia's cousins laughed. Grandmother always refused to throw that hideous thing away. Another shrugged. It's probably worthless. Nobody would pay for an old portrait of some forgotten woman. Someone smirked before turning toward Amelia. Why don't you take it? At least you'll leave here with something. The room filled with quiet chuckles. Amelia walked toward the portrait without responding. She gently brushed her fingers across its weathered frame, remembering countless afternoons sitting beside her grandmother as the painting hung silently in the old library. Eleanor had never explained why it mattered, only insisting that it should never be sold. I'll take it, Amelia said softly. Her relatives looked relieved, happy to rid themselves of what they believed was nothing more than useless clutter. Later that evening, after carefully loading the portrait into her small car, Amelia paused before closing the trunk. The fading sunlight fell across the canvas, illuminating the painted woman's face for just a moment. A chill crept down her spine. The woman's eyes seemed fixed on her, not with the lifeless stare of a portrait, but with an unsettling expression that felt almost expectant, as though she had been waiting for Amelia all along. Chapter 2. A Lifetime of Being Overlooked. Long before the portrait became hers, Amelia had learned what it felt like to be invisible. She was only 9 years old when a tragic accident claimed the lives of both her parents, leaving her with little more than a suitcase of clothes and memories that faded faster than she wanted to admit. Overnight, she found herself passed between relatives who saw her less as family and more as an obligation they could never quite escape. Most of them lived comfortably. Their sprawling homes, expensive cars, and lavish vacations stood in painful contrast to Amelia's modest life. Family gatherings only sharpened that divide. While her cousins received thoughtful gifts, praise, and promises of bright futures, Amelia was often handed whatever remained: an old sweater, a forgotten bedroom, or polite smiles that vanished the moment she left the room. Whispers followed her wherever she went. She's not really one of us. Her parents made terrible decisions. She'll never fit into this family. Each careless remark carved another wound into a heart already burdened by loss. Only one person refused to let those words define her. Her grandmother, Eleanor, never treated Amelia as a burden. Instead, she welcomed her into the quiet corners of the old manor, where the noise of judgment couldn't reach them. Together they spent long afternoons reading by the fireplace, tending the neglected rose garden, or wandering through rooms filled with forgotten history. But there was one room Eleanor rarely unlocked. At the end of the mansion's western corridor stood an old oak door secured by a heavy brass key she carried everywhere. Behind it was the library, a place filled with leather-bound books, fading maps, and the mysterious portrait that had fascinated Amelia since childhood. Whenever they entered, Eleanor would carefully lock the door behind them. If Amelia asked who the woman in the painting was, her grandmother would simply smile. Some truths survive inside things people stop seeing. The words made little sense to a child, yet Eleanor spoke them often, as though repeating an old promise rather than offering advice. Sometimes Amelia caught her grandmother standing silently before the portrait, gently brushing dust from its frame with almost reverent care. There was sadness in her eyes, but also determination, as if she were guarding something far more valuable than paint and canvas. As the years passed, Eleanor grew older, yet one instruction never changed. No matter what happened, "Promise me one thing, Amelia," she would say, her voice steady despite her age. "Whatever anyone offers you, never let that portrait be sold." At the time, Amelia believed it was simply sentimental attachment. She had no idea her grandmother was protecting a secret that generations had risked everything to keep hidden. Chapter 3. The Portrait's Impossible Details. The portrait barely fit through the front door of Amelia's small cottage. Compared to the grand halls of her grandmother's manor, the modest living room seemed almost too humble for such an imposing piece. She leaned the canvas carefully against the wall, unsure where it belonged, then stood back and studied it in silence. Under the bright afternoon light, the painting looked even older than she remembered. Dust clung to every carved corner of its weathered frame, while a web of fine cracks stretched across the painted surface like tiny rivers frozen in time. Remembering how carefully Eleanor had always cared for it, Amelia filled a small bowl with warm water, gathered a soft cloth, and began removing decades of dust. Slowly, details that had long been hidden started to emerge. The woman's gown was far more elaborate than Amelia had ever noticed. Intricate golden embroidery curled across the sleeves in repeating patterns unlike any she'd seen before. Tiny embroidered lilies intertwined with crowned stags, each stitch painted with astonishing precision. Around the woman's neck rested an unusual sapphire pendant. At first glance, it appeared decorative, but after wiping away another layer of grime, Amelia realized the gemstone was surrounded by an unfamiliar crest, a crowned phoenix encircled by 13 small stars. She frowned. It wasn't a symbol she recognized from any modern royal family. Even stranger, part of the crest seemed intentionally concealed beneath a layer of cracked paint, as though someone had deliberately tried to erase it. Curiosity soon outweighed uncertainty. Using her phone, Amelia photographed the portrait from every angle and emailed the images to Mr. Julian Mercer, a respected art conservator at the local museum. She expected a simple opinion about its age or value. Instead, her phone rang less than an hour later. Julian's voice sounded unusually tense. "Where did you get this painting?" "It belonged to my grandmother." A long silence followed. "I need to examine it in person," he finally replied. "Please don't clean it any further. Don't attempt any restoration. And whatever you do, don't let anyone else handle it." "What is it?" Amelia asked. "I honestly don't know yet," he admitted. "But if what I'm seeing is genuine, I need time to verify a few things before I say anything." Before Amelia could press him further, he politely ended the call. The conversation left her with more questions than answers. By evening, another mystery arrived. An email appeared in her inbox from an unknown sender. There was no greeting, no signature, and no explanation. Just a single sentence. "I'll pay $2 million for the portrait. No inspection required. Name your price." Amelia stared at the screen in disbelief. Who would offer a fortune for a painting they had never even seen in person? For the first time, she began to wonder whether her grandmother had been protecting far more than an old family heirloom. Chapter 4. The family suddenly wants it back. Amelia slept little that night. The anonymous offer lingered in her mind long after she had turned off the lights. $2 million for a portrait no one had wanted less than 24 hours earlier made no sense. She convinced herself it had to be some elaborate scam, yet an uneasy feeling refused to leave. By the following afternoon, the mystery deepened. Her phone began vibrating with calls from relatives who had barely spoken to her in years. The first was her cousin Victoria. "I've been thinking," she said in an unusually cheerful voice. "That portrait was part of the family collection. Grandmother never intended for it to leave the manor. It would probably be best if you brought it back." Amelia frowned. "Yesterday, you called it hideous." "Well, perhaps we judged it too quickly." Before Amelia could answer, the call ended. Within an hour, 2 more relatives contacted her with nearly identical requests. Their words were different, but the message was always the same: return the portrait. The sudden change in attitude was impossible to ignore. Later that evening, the family lawyer called with troubling news. "There appears to be a complication," he said carefully. "What kind of complication?" "The original copy of your grandmother's previous will has disappeared from our archives. Someone accessed the records overnight." Amelia felt her stomach tighten. "Does that affect my inheritance?" "We're still investigating. For now, I strongly advise you not to transfer or sell any item you inherited until the matter is resolved." The call ended, leaving more uncertainty than reassurance. Days later, an official letter arrived from attorneys representing several members of the Ashcroft family. They argued that the portrait had been distributed by mistake and demanded its immediate return pending legal review. It no longer felt like a disagreement over an inheritance. It felt like the beginning of a battle. Julian Mercer finally called again, his tone lower than before. "I've confirmed enough to tell you one thing," he said. "This painting is historically significant, far beyond its artistic value." "Can you explain?" "Not yet. There are pieces missing, and someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to keep them hidden." Those words echoed in Amelia's mind as darkness settled over her quiet neighborhood. Unable to sleep, she glanced through her living room window toward the empty street. At first, everything seemed still. Then she noticed a black sedan parked beneath the old oak tree across the road. Its headlights were off. The engine wasn't running. Inside, a lone figure sat motionless, facing her house. As Amelia watched, the silhouette slowly lifted a pair of binoculars toward her window. Someone wasn't interested in buying the portrait anymore. Someone was watching it. Chapter 5: Secrets Hidden Beneath the Paint. The morning after spotting the mysterious watcher outside her home, Amelia made a decision she could no longer postpone. If the portrait truly held the answers everyone seemed desperate to hide, it belonged in the hands of professionals. Under Julian Mercer's guidance, the painting was transported to the museum's conservation laboratory, a secure facility where centuries-old masterpieces had been restored with painstaking precision. Before the canvas was even touched, conservators photographed every inch of its surface, documenting each crack, faded pigment, and worn brushstroke. Then came the first scan. Using infrared imaging, the team expected to uncover minor repairs or an artist's early sketches. Instead, the monitor displayed something that silenced the entire room. Beneath the visible portrait of the elegant woman was another painting. It was almost perfectly concealed, separated by layers of carefully applied pigments that should never have existed together. As the digital image sharpened, a second face emerged, older, sterner, and dressed in unmistakably regal clothing. Julian stared at the screen in disbelief. "This wasn't painted over because of damage," he whispered. "Someone wanted this person erased." Over the following days, the restoration continued with extraordinary caution. Tiny flakes of later paint were removed under powerful microscopes, revealing details hidden for generations. Near the figure's shoulder, the faint outline of a magnificent royal insignia slowly appeared, a crowned phoenix surrounded by 13 stars, the same mysterious crest Amelia had noticed while cleaning the portrait at home. This time, however, the symbol was complete, untouched, and unmistakably intentional. But the greatest surprise came from the back of the canvas. As conservators carefully separated the original linen from a later backing, several folded fragments of handwritten parchment slipped free from between the layers. Though brittle with age, the ink remained remarkably legible. The notes contained names, dates, and cryptic instructions, along with repeated references to the rightful blood and the final guardian. Julian exchanged uneasy glances with the museum's lead historian. This wasn't restoration, she said quietly. This was concealment. Every discovery pointed to the same conclusion. The portrait had been deliberately altered to hide both the person's identity and the history surrounding them. Someone, centuries ago, had gone to extraordinary lengths to disguise the truth. That evening, as the conservation team locked the laboratory and prepared to leave, an alarm shattered the silence. Security cameras captured two masked figures forcing open a rear entrance to the restoration studio. They moved with purpose, heading directly toward the room where the portrait was stored. Fortunately, reinforced security doors delayed them just long enough for guards to arrive, sending the intruders fleeing into the darkness before they could reach the painting. When Amelia received Julian's late-night phone call, his voice carried none of the cautious optimism it once had. "They're no longer just searching for the portrait," he said gravely. "They're willing to commit crimes to get it." For the first time since inheriting the painting, Amelia realized this mystery was no longer confined to forgotten history. It had become a very real danger, one that was growing with every secret the portrait revealed. Chapter 6. The Erased Royal Bloodline. The attempted break-in transformed the investigation overnight. What had begun as the examination of an old family portrait was now treated as a matter of historical significance. The museum tightened its security, restricting access to only a handful of trusted experts. Historians, genealogists, and archivists from across the country were quietly invited to examine the newly uncovered symbols and handwritten notes. For nearly a week, Amelia heard very little. Every specialist seemed to be chasing fragments of a puzzle that had remained unsolved for centuries. Then Julian called. "We've identified the crest." Amelia held her breath. "It belonged to the House of Valmont," he said, "a royal family that officially disappeared during the civil conflicts more than 300 years ago." The name meant nothing to Amelia, but the expressions on the historians' faces when she arrived at the museum told her everything she needed to know. Pinned across a large table were faded maps, ancient letters, and copies of royal records gathered from archives throughout Europe. Together, they painted a story that history books had long declared finished. According to official accounts, every legitimate member of the House of Valmont had died during the kingdom's violent collapse. Their estates were seized, their titles abolished, and their bloodline declared extinct. But the newly discovered notes suggested something entirely different. One child had survived. Hidden by loyal servants, the young heir had escaped the palace under a false identity and vanished into ordinary life. From that moment forward, every generation lived without titles, disguising their ancestry to protect themselves from those who wanted the royal line erased forever. As researchers compared birth records, church registries, and census documents, unsettling inconsistencies began to appear. Entire pages were missing. Signatures changed without explanation. Family names were crossed out and replaced. In some records, decades simply disappeared. The deeper they searched, the stranger the pattern became. Each surviving family tree ended abruptly at the exact point where Amelia's own ancestry should have begun. It was as though someone had carefully cut away every branch leading to her family, while leaving the rest untouched. "This isn't coincidence," one genealogist said, laying several altered documents side by side. "Someone systematically rewrote these records." Julian nodded grimly. "Not just one document. Hundreds of them." Amelia stared at the evidence in stunned silence. All her life, she had believed she came from an ordinary family marked by quiet misfortune. Now she was confronting something far more extraordinary. Someone hadn't merely hidden the truth. They had manipulated history itself, erasing names, destroying identities, and burying an entire royal bloodline so completely that the world had forgotten it ever existed. The portrait was no longer revealing a family secret. It was exposing one of history's greatest deceptions. Chapter 7. The Race Against Hidden Enemies. The museum's discoveries were never meant to become public. Yet somehow, fragments of the investigation escaped beyond the laboratory walls. Within days, Amelia's quiet life descended into chaos. Luxury cars began appearing outside her cottage at all hours. Wealthy collectors sent formal letters offering unimaginable sums for the portrait, insisting they wished only to preserve an important piece of history. International auction houses expressed sudden interest, while private investigators appeared in nearby towns asking questions about Amelia's family. At the same time, attorneys representing distant branches of the Ashcroft family filed new legal claims, arguing that any historical discoveries connected to the portrait belonged to the entire family rather than to a single heir. Everyone wanted the painting. No one seemed interested in the truth. The anonymous messages grew darker. At first, they arrived as emails with no sender. History is safer buried. Then came handwritten notes slipped beneath Amelia's front door. Walk away before someone gets hurt. Soon afterward, her phone rang late one evening. The caller remained silent for several seconds before a calm voice whispered, "Some families survive by remembering. Others survive by forgetting." The line went dead. As investigators searched for additional evidence, the mystery only deepened. Important documents vanished from regional archives just hours before historians were scheduled to examine them. A retired priest who had agreed to discuss forgotten parish records abruptly canceled the interview, claiming he had remembered nothing at all. Another elderly witness refused to open his door after receiving visitors the night before. "They told me the past should stay buried," he confessed through the locked entrance. "Please don't come back." Then Julian uncovered something even more disturbing. While reviewing old estate correspondence preserved in Eleanor's personal files, he found decades of receipts, photographs, and handwritten observations that suggested Amelia had never been left unprotected. Someone had quietly watched over her since childhood. School photographs contained the same unfamiliar man standing in the background years apart. A charity event, a graduation ceremony, even her parents' funeral. Always at a distance, always watching. No one knew whether he was a guardian or a hunter. The realization shattered Amelia's remaining sense of security. Every stranger suddenly felt suspicious. Every unexpected phone call carried hidden meaning. Even trusted allies began withholding information, claiming it was for her own safety. For the first time since inheriting the portrait, Amelia understood that she wasn't simply unraveling a forgotten chapter of history. She was running against people who had spent generations protecting its secrets. And if they had followed her all her life without being noticed, there was no way of knowing who among those around her could still be one of them. Chapter 8: The Hidden Chamber and the Forgotten Archive. For weeks, the restoration team had focused almost entirely on the portrait's central figure. But one evening, while studying a high-resolution scan, Julian noticed something everyone else had overlooked. The landscape in the background wasn't imaginary. Behind the elegantly dressed woman stood the faint outline of a manor house, partially hidden by towering oak trees and softened by centuries of fading paint. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than artistic decoration. But when the image was digitally enhanced, remarkable architectural details emerged: a distinctive clock tower, 3 stone chimneys, and a curved staircase leading to a secluded eastern wing. An architectural historian compared the painting with records of long-forgotten estates. Only one location matched. It was an abandoned countryside manor nearly 80 miles away, once belonging to the House of Valmont before its sudden disappearance from history. The estate had remained empty for generations, dismissed as little more than a decaying ruin after changing hands countless times. Within hours, Amelia, Julian, and a small team of historians secured permission to explore the property. The mansion stood silent beneath an overcast sky, its cracked windows and ivy-covered walls bearing the weight of centuries. Dust filled every hallway, while collapsed ceilings and broken furniture hinted at the grandeur that had once existed there. The portrait became their guide. Comparing its painted interior with the surviving architecture, they followed a narrow corridor to the eastern wing. There, behind an enormous fireplace carved with the same crowned phoenix they had uncovered beneath the layers of paint, Amelia noticed a small stone that seemed slightly out of place. She pressed it. A deep mechanical rumble echoed through the walls. Slowly, part of the fireplace shifted aside, revealing a concealed passage that had remained hidden for centuries. At the end of the narrow staircase waited a windowless chamber untouched by time. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound journals, sealed wooden chests, rolled parchments, and dozens of documents preserved inside wax-lined cases. Royal seals bearing the Valmont crest remained remarkably intact, while carefully organized genealogical records traced the family line across generations. Near the center of the room rested a weathered oak desk. Inside its drawer lay a bundle of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The first letter was addressed in Eleanor Ashcroft's unmistakable handwriting. It revealed that Amelia's grandmother had discovered this hidden archive decades earlier. Rather than exposing it, she had quietly safeguarded its existence, returning regularly to ensure its secrets remained protected until the rightful descendant was ready. As Amelia carefully unfolded the remaining documents, one fact became impossible to deny. The journals, royal correspondence, birth records, and legal decrees all confirmed the same astonishing truth. One royal child had escaped the kingdom's destruction, and every piece of evidence pointed toward the surviving bloodline, leading directly to Amelia. For the first time, the answers were no longer hidden behind symbols or speculation. The truth was finally within reach. Chapter 9. The Royal Revelation. The hidden archive was transported under armed security to the museum's conservation center, where every document was carefully preserved before being examined. 4 days, experts worked around the clock, comparing wax seals, signatures, maps, and genealogical records with official archives across the country. No one wanted to make a claim of such magnitude without absolute proof. Then, one by one, every piece of evidence began aligning. The royal correspondence matched authenticated letters preserved in national collections. The seals were confirmed to be original. Ink analysis placed the documents in the exact historical period they claimed to represent. Most importantly, the family records formed an unbroken chain from the surviving Valmont heir to the present day. There were no missing generations, no unexplained gaps, no room left for doubt. In a quiet conference room, Julian gently slid the completed family tree across the table toward Amelia. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You are the last direct descendant of the House of Valmont." For several long moments, Amelia simply stared at the names before her. The lonely little girl who had spent her childhood believing she was an unwanted burden now found herself connected to a royal family the world believed had vanished centuries earlier. But the greatest surprise was still waiting inside Eleanor's final journal. Its pages revealed that Amelia's grandmother had uncovered the family's true identity nearly 40 years earlier. By then, she had already discovered that powerful individuals were still searching for the surviving bloodline, not to restore it, but to eliminate every remaining trace of its legitimacy. Rather than reclaiming wealth or demanding recognition, Eleanor made an extraordinary sacrifice. She chose a quiet life. She sold nearly everything she owned to maintain the abandoned estate in secret, protect the hidden archive, and ensure Amelia could grow up unnoticed. She accepted hardship, ridicule, and financial struggle because anonymity was the safest inheritance she could give her granddaughter. The portrait had never been merely a family keepsake. It was the key to everything. The painted landmarks had guided Amelia to the hidden chamber. The concealed symbols proved the family's royal identity. Even the handwritten notes hidden inside the canvas had served as instructions for whoever eventually uncovered the truth. As legal experts continued reviewing the archive, another astonishing discovery emerged. The surviving royal line had never legally surrendered its ownership. Multiple countryside estates, protected investment trusts established generations earlier, priceless works of art, and valuable mineral rights had remained dormant for centuries, waiting for a rightful heir to establish a legitimate claim. The forgotten fortune was no legend. It was legally documented. It still existed. Yet even as the room filled with quiet amazement, a security officer hurried inside, his face drained of color. "The court just received an emergency injunction," he announced. "Someone is trying to block every claim before they're officially recognized." The greatest mystery had finally been solved. But the battle for Amelia's inheritance, and for the truth itself, was only beginning. Chapter 10. The Battle for the Truth. Within days, the discovery that had remained hidden for centuries became the center of national attention. Courtrooms filled with historians, legal scholars, journalists, and representatives from institutions determined to challenge Amelia's claim. What began as a dispute over a forgotten portrait had evolved into one of the most extraordinary inheritance cases in modern history. The opposition spared no effort. Their attorneys argued that the archive had been fabricated, the family records altered, and the royal correspondence cleverly forged. They insisted the hidden chamber had been staged and accused the museum's experts of allowing emotion to cloud their professional judgment. If these claims are accepted, one lawyer declared before the court, history itself becomes vulnerable to fiction. The accusation was serious. So was the response. Independent laboratories from multiple countries were invited to examine every artifact. Specialists analyzed the parchment fibers, the chemical composition of the ink, the age of the wax seals, and even microscopic traces left by centuries-old pigments. One report after another reached the same conclusion. The documents were authentic. The journals had been written exactly when they claimed. The seals belonged to the House of Valmont. Nothing had been fabricated. As the legal battle continued, conservators completed the final stage of restoring the portrait itself. Layers of darkened varnish that had obscured the original surface for generations were carefully removed under magnification. Then, beneath the lower edge of the frame, something extraordinary appeared. Hidden within the artist's final brushstrokes was an inscription so faint it had remained invisible for centuries. The words had been intentionally blended into the background using pigments that only became distinguishable after complete conservation. The conservation laboratory fell silent as the inscription was translated. To those who bear our blood, let neither fear nor greed inherit this legacy. Protect the truth, defend justice, and let the rightful name rise again when the time is safe. Beneath the message were the signatures of the last reigning monarch and the royal guardian entrusted with protecting the surviving heir. For the first time, the portrait itself identified the rightful descendants and explained why the family's identity had been hidden. The inscription became the defining piece of evidence. News outlets across the country broadcast the discovery, while historians publicly acknowledged that an entire chapter of royal history had been deliberately erased. Public sympathy shifted dramatically toward Amelia and the team that had uncovered the truth. Meanwhile, investigators followed the trail of altered records uncovered during the case. The inquiry exposed decades of document tampering, fraudulent inheritance claims, and coordinated efforts to suppress historical evidence. Arrests soon followed. Those who had spent generations burying the truth were finally being held accountable, not only for attempting to steal a fortune, but for rewriting history itself. Justice, after centuries of silence, had finally begun to catch up. Chapter 11. The Fortune Hidden Across Generations. The court's final ruling marked the end of one battle and the beginning of an entirely new chapter. After months of exhaustive legal review, the House of Valmont's surviving inheritance was officially recognized. Trusts that had remained dormant for centuries were finally released. Forgotten land holdings, hidden beneath outdated ownership records, returned to their rightful heir. Priceless works of art, long stored in private collections under disputed titles, were reclaimed, while investment funds established generations earlier had quietly grown through decades of careful stewardship. Financial experts estimated the combined value of the recovered estates, historical assets, and protected trusts at several $100 million. It was the kind of fortune that could transform anyone's life overnight. Many expected Amelia to disappear into a world of luxury, surrounded by grand estates and unimaginable wealth. Instead, she honored the woman who had sacrificed everything to protect the truth. The abandoned Valmont Manor was carefully restored, not as a private palace, but as a museum dedicated to preserving the family's history and the extraordinary journey that had brought it back into the light. Historians, students, and visitors from around the world were welcomed to explore the archive that had survived centuries of secrecy. Other neglected family properties were repaired and converted into libraries, cultural centers, and community spaces, ensuring that places once hidden by fear would now serve future generations. Amelia also established the Eleanor Ashcroft Foundation, creating scholarships for young historians, art conservators, and students who had lost parents at an early age. She wanted others facing loneliness and hardship to receive the opportunities she had nearly been denied. As she walked through the restored manor one quiet evening, Amelia paused before a window overlooking the gardens her grandmother had loved. She thought about the frightened child who had spent years believing she belonged nowhere. The fortune had changed her circumstances. The truth had changed her life. She finally understood what Eleanor had been protecting all those years. The greatest inheritance was never measured in land, titles, or wealth. It was the courage to protect what was right, the strength to carry a forgotten legacy with humility, and the responsibility to ensure that history could never again be buried by greed or fear. Only then did Amelia realize she had inherited something far greater than a kingdom. She had inherited its soul.